Stephen Rea, do you remember where you were and what you were doing around about 7 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, September the 23rd, 1980?
Well, I'm assuming that's the opening night, is it? Yeah, I was probably vomiting somewhere, you know.
Really?
I would say I was, you know. Extremely nervous, a very high-powered moment. The buzz in the Guildhall was intense.
This was the premiere of Brian Friel's Translations. I mean, at this stage, you were a well-established stage actor.
Oh, yeah. I'd been working in London for a long time. This was my way of coming home. I'd long wanted to start a company of my own.
Why had you had to go away in the first place? What was that journey that you took into?
Well, I started in the Abbey. That was my first professional job, was in the Abbey.
Well, you were from a Protestant background in the north, Queen's University. So what brings you down to the Abbey?
Well, I had a huge interest in a theatre that seemed to have something to say and wanted to say it to the community that it existed in. That was my first thought. A particular interest in the moment when 1904, after the Gaelic League was begun and there was an idea of a national theatre before there was a nation. I found all that very interesting. That artists of the highest calibre, you know, Yeats and Synge, these were Anglo-Irish people, inverted commas, engaging with, inverted commas, what's called native Irish. So it was a huge, significant moment, it seemed to me, and that's why I came to the Abbey.
And did you find any remaining sense of that there?
No. No, there was no sense of purpose, no intellectual mettle. The actors were dispirited, it seemed to me. Wonderful actors, though, tremendous actors, but they were demoralised, it seemed to me.
Steve, was there any moment that crystallised what you felt about the Abbey?
It was a play called The Wing of Duvessa, and it was set in Ireland in the Cromwellian period. And it was a very, very, what you'd call through other kind of production. Didn't really seem to have much focus. The writer, with M.J. Malloy, came on stage. It was his first night to receive the applause, and he said, I just wanted to write a play that would investigate what it was like to live behind an iron curtain. And I nearly fell off the stage, that this had never been discussed. And I suppose what had happened in the period between independence and the time that I joined the Abbey was that Ireland really was silent in lots of ways, you know. There wasn't a huge discourse occurring, and it wasn't happening in the Abbey where it should have been most likely to happen.
We're joined also by Kevin Whelan, who's director of the University of Notre Dame Centre in Dublin. Kevin, the 1970s in Ireland, could you give us just a sense what was happening in Northern Ireland, what the atmosphere was?
The play Translations happened in Derry, which is obviously on the border, and in some respects you could say that 1970s was, in both jurisdictions, was a period of intense kind of failure, because in the early 70s with the Troubles, I suppose the Provost had the idea that it would be kind of a short war, over and out kind of, but by the late 1970s it was very clear that the North was bogged down and was going kind of nowhere fast, and that there was a real sense that it was descending down through these kind of Dantean circles into an ever-deepening kind of morass, and there was a real sense that it was totally kind of stuck and that nothing could move it out of the rancid place that it had kind of reached, right? The South had its moment of effervescence in the 1960s, but that came to a shuddering halt with the first oil crisis of 1973, and then the South entered into a kind of a debt spiral economically through the 1970s and into the 1980s. But it looked like the South was a failed state economically. Its young people were leaving in even greater numbers than they'd left under the British century earlier.
Could there have been civil war?
There was a form of civil war. I think people can't remember that in 1980 it was as low as it could go almost. Nobody could find a way out of it. Nobody had the language to find the way out of it. And what Friel used to always say to me was, this is all about language, you know. This is about language. And we went out into the small towns of the north and the south armed with nothing but language.
And the great high point of the play Translations is the interaction between the Englishman and the Irish girl on the stage, who are communicating even though they don't have a common language.
Yeah, well, let's hear that scene now. That's the scene between, the love scene between Maura, the girl from the village.
Soft hands, a gentleman's hands.
Because if you could understand me,
And Yolland.
I spend my days either thinking of you or gazing up at your house in the hope that you will appear even for
the young lieutenant.
Every evening you walk by yourself along Trabawn, and every morning you wash yourself in front of your tent.
I would tell you how beautiful you are, curly-haired Moira. I would so like to tell you how beautiful you
Your
are.
arms are long and thin, And the skin on your shoulders is very
I would
white.
tell you.
Don't stop. I know what you're saying.
I would tell you how I want to be here, to live here, always. With you. Always, always.
Always? What is that word? Always.
Yes, yes, always.
You're trembling.
Yes, I'm trembling because of you.
I'm trembling too.
I've made up my mind. I'm not going to leave here.
Listen to me. I want you to, soldier.
Don't stop. I know what you're saying.
I want to live with you. Anywhere. Anywhere at all. Always. Always.
Always. What is that word, always?
Take me away with you, George.
Stephen, how did the play come about?
Well, it is miraculous in the sense that Imelda Foley, who's a woman who worked in the Arts Council in Belfast, told me when I was at home once that there was some money to do a play. Did I think I'd like to do a play, you know? And so I said, yeah, and I went and I visited Friel in Muff, where he lived at the time, and he said I'm working on a play, he said, and that was the play. So it is miraculous, because Friel has many, many wonderful plays.
And of course, the Field Day as a company, as a project, was kind of accidental, wasn't it?
It was basically, you know, there we were, had to give ourselves a name. Friel said, what about Stephen Rea? And it became Field Day. I'm afraid it's as simple as that. And then when we included the other guys on the board, you know, we had incredible minds in there, you know, Dean and Heaney and Paul and Hammond. And we talked about everything. And out of it would emerge what we wanted to do. But I was looking, of course, for a theatre of ideas, no question. That's the kind of theatre I want to be involved in. Of course, ideas arrive rather than... You don't start with a fixed idealistic position, which was actually attributed to us. Everybody said, this is old wine in new bottles, the old wine in new bottles. It was the old nationalist wine. It wasn't at all, you know, and people fail to see that actually in translations what Friel is saying is you have to move on. You have to...
Always.
There's no such thing as always. You have to move on.
Always.
So it wasn't just in a fixed nationalist position.
We come to the Guildhall. What was the Guildhall?
Guildhall was the centre of administration in Derry of the Unionist Council, the dominant Unionist power. It was kind of big colonial building.
It wasn't numerical dominance.
No, it was the precise opposite. It was run on a system of gerrymander, as we know. But by the time we came to do translations, there was now a majority council, which meant a nationalist council. And they were very, very hospitable to the idea of us doing a play there. You know, we made it up as we went along. People didn't do plays in Derry. A world premiere of a play by Brian Friel occurred in Dublin, or maybe New York. It didn't happen in Derry. So there was that. The building itself was not a theatre building. That's why you were making your mark on the building afresh. And we performed the play in front of the giant organ that's at the back of the... So everybody came in there, the local people would have a feeling about that building, which the play was subverting.
Now, local halls are all very well, but could people hear?
Well, I'm telling you, it was hard. Acoustically it was poor.
Did that bother you?
I didn't enjoy that. You had to work very hard to make a play that you should hear perfectly. You had to work very hard, you know. I've had more relaxed... To go back to your original question, I've been more relaxed in the theatre, but...
But did it matter to you then, though, when the then Unionist mayor of Derry in the power sharing Derry situation, Marlene Jefferson, actually led the standing ovation at the end of the play?
Well, you know, Marlene Jefferson is a very lovely woman. You know, she said to me, Stephen, all I care about is Derry. And that something was happening in Derry was very important to her. Now, a lot of Unionist businessmen would not have brought... This is the problem that we had with Derry. They didn't get the university. It went to Coleraine.
That was a few years before. There was a big tussle
that's what
over
caused the civil rights campaign.
The siting of the second university in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, that was the catalyst for the civil rights campaign. Unionist businessmen would take projects out of the city, even though they lived in Derry. But Marlene was 100% for Derry. And when she stood up at the end, I thought the evening had been rather stiff in a way, as it wasn't our most relaxed performance. She stood up, and it's what I would call a Handel's Messiah moment, you know. When the monarch rose, everybody rose, and so now everybody And, because everybody in Derry was glad that people were there just doing something positive, like putting on a play. And it has to be remembered, whatever significance we see in the play now and in the putting on, for people there, it just meant, good God, there's something positive happening in this town. People at that time were hungry for plays. If you took, I don't know what it's like now, but if you took a play around Ireland in those days, everybody came, because if there's a show on in the local parish hall or the school, people came out,
Well, let's hear from Brian Friel himself now on that very issue. This is an interview with Brian Friel from the archives from the early 1980s.
Well, I think there was the enthusiasm of the audience was almost uniform around the country, but there is, of course, a great excitement in travelling, in bringing a theatrical enterprise around a country anyhow, because you're bringing it very often to people who very seldom see theatre, so they have a much more spontaneous and a much less educated, in quotes, response to a theatre. Their responses are more open and more spontaneous. And this was really one of the purposes in the field of the enterprise, was to bring theatre to places that won't have an opportunity to see good theatre.
That was the wonderful thing about taking a play like Translations around. Everybody, it wasn't just stuck in a ghetto in Dublin, a theatrical cul-de-sac. You were out finding out what audiences were feeling. And of course they would feel very different things in Galway, say, than they would in Coleraine. But that was the thrill of doing that play and subsequent plays.
How would you know what they were feeling with it?
Well, the extraordinary thing that you felt immediately was how Friel was so completely in touch with what Nationalist Ireland thought, because the laughter was, the thought was all the same, different in the north, in parts of the north.
I mean, you played in unionist places.
Well, you tried to. You weren't always invited. Mm-hmm. But when you did, there was a respect for the undeniable beauty of the play. You couldn't but respect it, but perhaps wasn't the same involvement.
Was there any hostility?
Never. No, not with that play ever, no.
Stephen, would you just tell us briefly the story of what happens in Translations?
It's set in a hedge school where the local pupils are receiving instruction in the classics, Latin and Greek. And at the same time, there's a British Army unit which is in the area remapping the place and putting English place names on the formerly Gaelic place names that exist. And it's that kind of conflict that occurs between those two elements.
Your character, Owen, just to make it clear exactly his role in the play, Owen arrives, he's the son of the hedge school master, but he's gone to Dublin, he's fluent English speaker, he's made a bit of money, he's in the pay of the British Army, he's working as a go-between, I suppose somewhat like the Iraqis hired by the British Army, as a go-between between...
Well, it's precisely the same. It's precisely the same. When the Americans went into Iraq, I thought, well, this is just like surrender and re-grant, isn't it? It's a whole imperialist project. Let's get the oil, and here they got the forests.
Yeah. And of course, every colonial situation where there's a difference of language will throw that up. There has to be interlocutors between, because it's not just that Owen is an interpreter, it's that he's an intellectual. He's somebody who understands the culture and can kind of explain it. But that's the position I think that the play ultimately comes to endorse, because when you start with Owen, it looks like the player is going to have a kind of a pop at him as a kind of a sellout and somebody who is self-aggrandizing and makes money out of exploiting his own culture, and who turns his back on his father and his lame brother and all of that. But by the end of the play, increasingly, even the family members begin to endorse Owen's position. So even the father says at the end of it,
we must learn those new names.
We must learn those new names.
We must learn where we live.
We must learn where we live.
We must make them our own.
We must learn to make them our own. We must make them our new home. That's almost the Owen position.
But Owen himself is retreating from that.
But exactly,
position.
what does Owen do at the end of the play?
It's only a catalogue of names. I know what it is.
Well, because I think he's not as conscious of persons as he appeared to be.
A mistake. My mistake.
He sees the repercussions of what he's done.
Nothing to do with us.
And he realises that he's destroying this culture.
He goes off to join the provost.
Basically, I'd say he does, yeah.
I've got to go. I've got to see Doty Dan Doty. What about I'll be back soon. Owen, take care!
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, we say the Provos, but I mean, he's this, resistance movement.
Yeah, the Donnelly twins are really the kind
The
of
Donnelly
Provost,
twins.
and then they never actually appear in the play at all. But they're off stage in the same way, perhaps as in Derry. The provisional movement. I know Martin McGuinness was in the audience on the night or whatever, but the provisionals would have been off stage as well in some fundamental way. You know, the presence of that, and this is why the play's performance in Derry, which had been a real kind of hotspot, that actually gives the play a certain frisson which it wouldn't have had if it had been performed in London or in Dublin.
When you've got twin orthodoxies in opposition, you have to use a different method to discuss, and theatre can do that because it's not insisting on something. It offers a life on the stage, and it allows you to experience that and take what you can out of it. It doesn't insist, and we never did, despite what people who are critics might have said, we never postulated one position against another.
Kevin, is it a sectarian play?
No.
Let's rehearse those criticisms then. There's the character of Lieutenant Lancy, who's ignorant and who can't distinguish between Irish and Latin, for example. There's the character of Owen, which Stephen played, who's effectively a collaborator, who is potentially or initially conceived of as a Queasling. And then Lancy, at the end of the play, then posits that he's going to raise the village. He becomes a kind of Cromwellian figure.
If Yolland has not been found, we are all going to be evicted. Lancy has issued that order. Dictum imperatoris.
Kevin Whelan.
Owen in the play he's really the hero of it. He's actually the one who, even though he is in between, even though he could be seen in some ways as a traitor or as a Quisling, he's actually the one who makes possible the forward movement. And it's Owen who, in one sense, looks like he's kind of betraying the tribe and the fixed position. It's Owen who actually creates the possibility of movement. And in a way, you could say that Owen becomes almost, I think, the voice of Friel and the voice of Field Day, because he is saying we cannot stay locked forever within these frozen languages and these frozen political positions.
Stephen Rea.
I just think that the criticism of being sectarian was that Friel should dare to write a play about this subject at all. I mean, we have to accept that the Ordnance Survey took place. We have to accept that there was a colonial presence in this country and that it ended with the Irish language being reduced. There's no question about that. That happened. I don't think he's wrong to draw his attention to it. What he says in it is, though, we have to think about how we deal with this now. It's no good having a situation where we're going to push the British soldiers down a bog hole, which is what happens to the Yolland,
the young lieutenant.
We can't live like that anymore, is what he's saying. We can't live in this fixed orthodox position. And I think that lifted people's heads a bit when we did it, you know.
Yeah. Stephen, your character, Owen, he was based on a figure called John O'Donovan, who was possibly one of the greatest ever scholars of the Irish language. Does the play not do a huge disservice to him?
Did it have to happen? I suppose it did. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that, Kevin. I mean, it's, in the play, Myra Chata says, I don't want to learn Latin and Greek. I want to learn English. I'm going to America. You know, so the realities of what the loss of the Irish language means is apparent in the play. The reality is there. How much can you take on? How much, you know?
Yeah, well, for example, there's a line where Hugh, the schoolmaster, is talking about a place and he refers to Lisnamuck. And Owen says, Lisnamuck, the fort of the pigs. It's become Swinefort. And to get to Swinefort, you pass through Greencastle and Fairhead and Strand Hill and Gorth and White Plains. They're ugly names. Is that a fair reflection of a great scholar of Irish and the work that he did?
But O'Donovan, the crucial thing about him, and this is what Friel does catch, is that O'Donovan believed himself that there was no future for the Irish language, that it could only exist as a language which told you about the past. You couldn't live your life in early Victorian England in the Irish language at that stage. It didn't and couldn't be a language of commerce, trade, modernity, civility. And of course that's what O'Donovan begins to do in his work for the Ordnance Survey, is to begin that translation out of the Irish into the English while trying to retain the spirit of it in the anglicised place names and whatever. And that's, I think, what Friel responds to. So while the treatment of O'Donovan in one sense in the play is very reductive and simplistic in some respects in relation to what John O'Donovan was. It does capture this fault line or this schizophrenia which seemed through O'Donovan, and which, of course, again, is a feature of colonial societies, because he himself is a conflicted man, and he himself didn't want his children to speak Irish. And you know, he says he respected it as a great thing, but as something whose day had kind of gone.
It was read very commonly, even in reviews at the time, it was read as historical. It was read by some as sort of sentimental history. Was that not a risk that was run in the play?
Absolutely, and I think, you know, the first person who would have been aware of that was obviously Friel himself, because he produces the next play, Communication Court, which is a farce, and which is
it's
almost
to,
a kind of an
to
anti-translation.
debunk all those pieties, yeah.
Which is to debunk the pieties, and which is kind of, you know, like, so like it wasn't as if Friel was somehow just some kind of a propagandist or a sentimentalist, or somebody who was presenting this rosy picture of a Gaelic kind of idyll.
Stephen Rea.
You know, the whole colonial thing that is the North has still to be unravelled, you know, and the terrible thing for me in this so-called peace process is that you've still got the twin orthodoxies now enshrined in government. You have two elections. You have an election in the Unionist community and an election in the Nationalist community. And there doesn't seem to be any process of ameliorating the standoff position.
Kevin, that word post-colonial, it is used about Field Day. Just tell us what it means.
It's the idea is that colonialism doesn't end when empire ends, as it were, that you are then left with a legacy which continues to inform the current way that you live, and that colonial legacy will still be apparent in societies which have apparently emerged from imperialism. It'll still be very, very present for generations afterwards.
But isn't there a problem with that? And that's this, that Ireland wasn't a colony.
Well, now, Colin, if you believe that, you believe anything.
It wasn't a colony?
It is an argument that describing Ireland as post-colonial is not appropriate, because it's a very different type of colonial or imperial situation to other colonies. And for example, it was part of the Union.
Yes, that's just a name.
But Ireland is a very complex situation in colonialism, and I think what is sometimes confused in the Irish situation is that, let's say, there's two types of colony, one of major types, let's say one of which is kind of a settler colony, and, you know, there are aspects of a settler colony in Northern Ireland, in the current Unionist population who came in the 16th and 17th century, right? But then there's another type of colony, more akin to the Indian one, where the people themselves kind of stay, but a kind of an administrative and political superstructure is imposed on top of them. It's much easier to deal with the aftermath of an administrative colony than it is to deal with the aftermath of a settler colony, because in a settler colony, what are you going to do with the Union? Send them all back home, you know, which was the narrow kind of Provo kind of take on it, like Brits Outer. But at the same time, it's not as simple as just, you know, what often happens in administrative colonies, the painting the postbox green type nationalism. In fact, you could say that the crisis in modern day Ireland is precisely because we have a problem of the state. When we transitioned from British rule in this country, we changed who ran the country, and we changed the colours of the post boxes, and we put a kind of a tin green veneer over the imperial kind of state. But in some respects, we never reconstructed the state itself. And it's that state now, that dead, inert, centralised, self-serving state. That state is what has now entered a kind of crisis in this phase in Ireland. And I think what Friel and Stephen Rea and the others in Field, but particularly Friel, what he was thinking about was kind of saying, can we imagine a cultural state? And that cultural state then can over time release or detonate the possibility of a political state. And that goes back precisely to the idea of the Abbey Theatre, because what they were trying to do was to stage a nation culturally, which then created the possibility of a political state emerging. Now in 2011, once again, we have a kind of a failed political state, or so everybody kind of tells us. And again, we need to kind of think our way out of it. And the only way we can think our way out of that is to do what Translations did, which is to interrogate the language, the very basis of the language that we use, which seems to me to have become a very humdrum, clapped out rhetoric, and people are trapped in that.
Stephen, so in the face of that, where is Field Day now?
Well, we still publish.
Why aren't you doing plays?
We are going to do plays.
You're going to do plays again?
Yeah, 2013.
Do you know what?
No.
And why?
I've wanted to have another go at it, but I couldn't imagine getting myself into the frame of mind to find the energy to get the money, but somebody's offering me money.
Why did you stop doing plays?
I'd done an awful lot of plays, you know. For 10 years we did plays. I toured Ireland for 10 years, one play a year, but it took up 6 months of the year. And then I personally decided it was time that I did some more films, and I did films, and now I may do plays again.
Was Brian Friel going to the Abbey with Dancing at Lunasa a big blow to Field Day?
That was a big blow to any theatre company to lose a major play. Of course it would be. When I say lose, we didn't have it, so we didn't lose it. But of course it was a blow.
Was it a critical blow?
I already knew that I couldn't, didn't have the energy to keep on the road. Theatre takes an enormous amount of energy. So it came to a natural end. I think 10 years is actually quite long. If you look at the golden period of the Abbey Theatre, it's actually very short. Any theatre movement doesn't have a long life.
Stephen, you once said of Field Day's origins that with what was happening in the North at the time, in the late 1970s, that you had to have a response. What about what's happening now?
Well, I think theatre has to respond, but I don't know how that's going to work, Before we responded to the Northern thing, it had been going on for 11 years, I think the thing is to start to utter and see what occurs, which is what we did. It was just this kind of miracle that it was this play. I just think the theatre has to be more consciously involved in uttering about the world that we're in, rather than leaving it up to others. I mean, because you only have to listen to the election campaign now. The language is so debased, it's unbelievable.
I think Friel is correct when he says that a political reimagination can only follow a cultural reimagination. And I think actually now that there's a tremendous moment of creativity coming, but it won't come from the voices that we've got used to listening to over the last 20 years. I think it's going to come from the immigrant generation. And as with the Abbey Theatre moment, as with the Field Day moment, that reinvestigation is going to be surprising, and it's going to kind of say there is another way.
Well, we've come to the end of this programme. I'd like to thank Stephen Rea and Kevin Whelan for joining me in the studio.